Yesterday, the European Parliament passed a motion approving that move to phase 2 of the negotiations, but emphasising that the UK must hold to the commitments it's made so far. That's after MEPs expressed concerns about some of the things Brexit Secretary David Davis has since said publicly about the agreement.
We had an agreement, then it was put into question in London, and that of course raises a lot of questions about any sort of agreement that we're making here, that you're making here with your counterparts. And I would say especially also about the future relationship, because if you can't trust one another, if you're not sure that whatever you agree is actually going to hold, then this is going to put a major strain on any future relationship.
Monsieur Barnier said earlier there were key areas upon which he wasn't prepared to make many concessions. Well, you didn't need to, sir, because you were up against Theresa May, and she was all for making as many concessions as she possibly could, including agreeing a ludicrous bill of up to 40 billion sterling for us to have the right to leave, a continued role for the European Court of Justice, and, in line with that, family reunions that mean, frankly, open-door immigration from the European Union is going to continue for years to come.
Nigel Farage there. Well, I'm now joined from Strasbourg by the German Green MEP Ska Keller, who we saw in that clip, and here in the studio, Anand Menon, Professor of European Politics and Foreign Affairs at King's College London. Welcome to both of you. Ska, first of all, how has Theresa May's defeat in the House of Commons last night been viewed in Europe?
Well, I don't think that this is really a problem. I mean, that the Parliament in Britain wants to be involved. That's very understandable, especially from common or like other parliamentarians, certainly. So that's not really the problem. The problem was really that the agreements that have been made here were put into question later by ministers, and that should not happen.
Right. Do you not trust the UK to live up to that agreement that has been talked about and will probably be signed off this week?
Well, the trust certainly hasn't increased in the last week, and I think that's a big problem because we're going to talk now about our future relationship, and trust is a very important issue there. So I really hope that also the British government will try to build trust rather than to destroy it. And now, of course, I get that it's politically a very difficult situation in London, but still we have to rely on one another. We have to trust each other, and whatever is said in London will also be heard here. That's something that is very important for the British government to understand.
Are you worried that the agreement on the divorce settlement could unravel during phase 2 of these negotiations?
I'm not too worried yet. It's very clear that there has been an agreement. We have seen it written. We have seen the word commit in that agreement. It will be transferred into a legally binding agreement. So at least we will know soon whether the British government stands up for its own words, and I would really hope that this is the case.
Right. I mean, Gisela, do you think David Davis was reckless when he made those comments about it just being a statement of intent? The implication being, obviously, from Ska Keller's point of view, that they can't trust that agreement.
Well, you know, if you read the agreement, it starts off by saying nothing is agreed until everything is agreed.
Right.
And there's a clear understanding of that this is a process, and what the United Kingdom committed itself to, I think it is committed to, subject to the overall package. So I think it's a bit of a storm in a teacup. That bit of the argument.
Right. Do you think it is a storm in a teacup, to use that British phrase, Ska Keller, that nothing is agreed, though, until everything is agreed? Do you understand that sentiment in the agreement?
Well, yeah, of course, it's always an agreement that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. But that's very different from saying, oh, there's just merely intentions. If Davis would have said, yeah, look, guys, we have to see the overall package, sure, no problem. But he was putting it in a way that the commitment is only maybe an intention or not. So I think there is a real difference. And I don't have any problem with that one has to look at the overall package once it's there. But I do have a problem with the commitment not being honored. I mean, you can say, yeah, so that for me is really important, and especially if we look at the future cooperation, then it's important that we're not just saying, oh, it's just an intention, when it's actually a commitment.
Right. Well, that is a problem, isn't it, for Theresa May and the government? Because if she hasn't got the trust of the negotiators on the other side, then that cooperation is not going to be there.
But I think they should have the trust, because part of the argument arose out of regulatory alignment. And there was a sentence in there which says, in the absence of any agreement, it then talked about the Northern Ireland border. And I think the two uncertainties kind of were conflated in there. I don't think there's ever been any intention to do anything other than, honour what was the clear things which were agreed there as part of an overall package.
Right. Anna, if I can bring you in here, do you think there is a risk, though, that the UK doesn't live up to its commitments that it's made on the divorce settlement, on the rights of EU citizens, and on the Northern Irish border, which many people say hasn't really been sorted? Will it impact on the UK's ability to secure a trade deal with the EU?
Well, I think there are probably three dangers here. The first is that the agreement itself is awfully woolly, which means that ministers here can say one thing which go completely against the understandings that they have of the agreement in Brussels. And alignment, as Gisela said, is understood very differently in Brussels to the way it seems to be understood by some ministers here. Secondly, this is a progress report, not a deal. So the British government is legally right in saying, yep, this is fine, this is as far as we got, but we're not bound to this because it hasn't been ratified. And the third thing is this: nothing is agreed till everything is agreed. The two sides mean something very different by that, and it's a really dangerous ambiguity. For the EU, this simply refers to phase one. That is and maybe phase two, which is transition. That is to say, this isn't wrapped up till everything to do with Article 50 and the transition is signed and sealed. For some members of the British government, they seem to think that includes the trade deal, and it really doesn't, because we're not going to have one when we have to put our name on this document.
Right, so there's not going to be a trade deal by the end of March 2019. Do you accept that, Gisela?
No, I don't accept that yet.
Why?
Because I think that's where all our energy has to go, and this will be part of the discussions now. That's part of where you move into phase two, and I'm not prepared to say we take that off the table at this stage.
But remember, phase two is transition, and I suspect that's going to take a while. The EU is not going to get negotiating guidelines for a trade deal till March, which gives us from March to October to sign a deep and comprehensive free trade deal. I just don't see how that is practically possible.
Right, so you don't think it's going to happen. Ska Keller, do you think there will be a trade deal done between the UK and the EU by the end of March 2019?
Well, I've been actually working on EU trade policy in the Trade Committee here, and the trade deals are really complicated things, just from the whole matter of what you have to deal with. It just takes really long. I mean, we haven't had any trade agreement that hasn't taken many years, so I really don't see how it can be so fast, and that's not a matter of bad intentions. It's just also a matter of practicalities and technicalities. So no, I don't see how we're going to get one so fast.
Right, well, I don't want to say 2 against 1 here, Gisela, but I mean, what do you think, what makes you think that there is time, never mind the will, to get a trade deal done?
Well, every trade deal that has so far been negotiated would have been one of where you had two diverging blocks, had to find a way of working together. This one is completely different, because you're starting from the point of already total convergence. So you're finding ways of how you continue to trade. So it is a different deal, and its complexity is of a different nature, and it can be done if the political will is there.
Right. Do you think that's the case, or do you think this is now all about transition, that the next stage will be about agreeing the terms of the 2-year or so transition that will come after March 2019?
I think transition will prove more complicated than many people think, simply because the sort of standstill agreement that people are talking about, where essentially we're in the market, in the customs union, but we're not a member state, is legally problematic, and I suspect that's going to drag. I think Gisela's right to a point. Absolutely, we start with full alignment. We start as a member state, so we're not Canada, where you've got to spend the first couple of years identifying areas of convergence and divergence. Nevertheless, looking to the future and where we want to cooperate, how, what sort of judicial oversight there's going to be, what particular customs arrangements we want to put in place, that's not going to happen overnight.
Will you accept oversight of the European Court of Justice during that transition period and possibly beyond when it comes to the rights of EU citizens?
There has to be a cut-off date, a complete cut-off date. And even on the European citizens, if you look at the deal, it actually is time-limited.
And when would that be?
For the European citizens, it actually has an 8-year limit, if I remember rightly.
And you accept that?
For the very small numbers where you make referrals by British judges, time-limited, small numbers, that's fine. But it's the automaticity of the European Court of Justice, which has, as to the transition period, I think that's you can negotiate. I'm sort of slightly more agnostic, but there has to be a clear end date.
Right, but you would accept being in the customs union, in the single market, freedom of movement, and some sort of judicial oversight during whatever period of transition?
No, I wouldn't put it the way you do, because you have to have agreed of what the final position is, and the transition is towards a clearly defined end state.
Right, but not if we haven't got a trade deal. Ska Keller, do you see the transition period of Britain remaining in a status quo position for those 2 years in terms of remaining in the single market, the customs union, and with ECJ oversight?
Yes, certainly, because I mean the transition phase is needed in order to define what sort of future cooperation we have, and I mean the ECJ issue especially is for us as in the Parliament very important for and especially of course in the citizens issue, and there you can't just have a cut-off date in any near future because the EU citizens are still going to be there, and we already see now that many have big problems to prolong their stay, to get a residence permit, are faced with really weird bureaucracy, so that also hasn't increased the trust that we could just leave it to British courts.
All right, Anna Menon, before you go, on last night's vote in the House of Commons, what does it mean in practice in terms of negotiating the terms of Brexit? Does it imperil Brexit in any way?
No, I don't think so, and I don't think we should assume that those who rebelled against the whip were intending to imperil Brexit. For some of them, this was procedural, this was about Parliament's role. And actually, when push comes to shove, a deal comes to Parliament next September, October. They have to vote on it. At the moment, it looks like the default condition will be no deal. So MPs will face a choice. You either vote for the deal or we Brexit with no deal. So actually, in terms of the dynamics of this process... You don't think it's likely
to reject the deal, then? You don't think it is likely MPs will reject it?
Well, I think Conservative MPs in particular will think carefully because it might bring the government down.
All right.